just curious as to the impetus for your change and perhaps some of the things that you've seen shift along with what you've done with your business model.
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having this discussion with me. It's a lot of fun. I think what I've been noticing is there's so much more complexity, and the gaps between how leaders manage that complexity and get to their goals and results are still pretty wide. And part of it's a function of not understanding that a complex problem cannot be addressed in the same way that a simple one can. So, the mindset shift is recognizing what type of a context or what type of a problem are you facing. Is it simple? Is it complicated? Or is it complex? Or is it chaotic? So that's part one of the equation. But part two is, how do you help your organization as a whole become more adaptable? So the key to all of this issue of leading through complexity is adaptability. And it's challenging with order and structure, process, procedure, that thing that we call bureaucracy in organizations. And I'm reminded of the joke, I think it was Stephen Wright that had the joke about getting a humidifier and a dehumidifier for his birthday and putting them in the same room to duke it out. And that's how I think about the order that we have in organizations and the adaptability that they need to continue to innovate. So it's like we have one serving one purpose, another purpose, but you have to bring that adaptability into the organization structure in some fashion. And it's, how some companies do it with a separate entrepreneurial arm of their company. They have a chief entrepreneur that's, up there with the CEO. Some of them, we hear it in hackathons, and we hear it in idea salons, and we hear it in different versions of what companies are doing to try to help stimulate innovation and bring better ideas into the organization. So it's helping leaders think at two different levels. So how do I face this in my individual context? How do I help my broader organization?
It's very interesting that you pointed that out, because I think, to your point, every company sees that there's a need for this, right? But they're all going about it in very different ways. And I think it's key to point out that when we're faced with some of these challenges, or a challenge that requires a response, some of them are I believe they all require us to pause and reflect perspectives, but some of them can be made very quickly. Some of these decisions, some of these activities can be made relatively quickly, but others cannot. So I'd like to sit on the complexity nature for just a moment. So when faced with a complex issue, and let's use an example, right now, there's a lot of leaders that are not as connected to their workforce as they have been historically. And I think it's caused many of them to grapple with different ways of going about what they believe to be the right way of conducting that relationship. But there's others that I think have moved toward, I think micromanagement is becoming more prominent now, unfortunately, again, because we feel that lack of control. So I'm curious, when you're spending time in these organizations and you are coaching and you've uncovered some of these complex issues, but again, it's about adaptability. How can we as leaders effectively adapt to this new environment in a way that's going to be meaningful for the organization and for the people that we lead?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is a challenge, because the tendency when you're feeling out of control for all of us is to go get control. And that's where the bureaucracy that we have in organizations, it just wants to have more control because it's facing things that are new, that are different. That's part of what makes organizational learning so difficult, is when you don't have, an unusual event happens and you don't have the experience with that event, you're not entirely sure at the beginning how to learn from it. So the first step in my mind is taking a step back and recognizing what is emerging around you. Recognizing that you're going to be seeing things that you don't have control over, that you're not going to be able to squelch. You're not going to be able to put a lid on it and say, good, now we're done. It's a completely different type of a problem. And it's like, when you take a pill for one thing and you end up with something else, another health issue. The body is complex. We don't always know how it's going to respond. So you can't just use traditional problem-solving techniques. When it comes to people and teams, what is so key here is much more diversity. So you want more diverse opinions, you want more of them, and it's really kind of stage based. So this is a big part of what I focus on is sense making. So how do we make sense of what's going on in the world, and how do we interpret what's going on and interpret it differently so that we can take some different actions? And so you've got to have, when something, for example, happens that catches you off guard, it's good to have a lot of opinions, more opinions, diverse opinions up front. So you want that divergence, that diversity of views to understand what's going on. And organizations have historically led that sense making, left it up to the senior levels in the organization. And it's a mistake, because an event that happens is going to be interpreted by them very different than, a first line leader. It's going to interpret that same event very differently. And then your middle managers are sitting right there at this intersection between everyone, what they're hearing above them, what they're hearing below them, and what their peers are saying to the side. So they're in a great position to help make sense out of something that appears chaotic. But then you reach a point where you need to make a quick decision and you need to act. So then that's where you've got to take all of those diverse opinions and consolidate them and synthesize them in some way that helps you pick a direction. Okay, so that's not necessarily finding a solution, because things are still emerging. So there's a lot of experimentation. There's a lot of trying something you haven't done before. It's a lot of taking risks, and that's hard, especially in organizations where risk taking is not rewarded, or it's, the penalty for failing is harsh. So you have to have some way of saying, what's the direction we're going to head with this? I mean, the pandemic is a great example of that. All right, so the first direction we headed was social distancing. That was the first thing that we learned and figured out to do. The next place that we headed was looking for different treatments. Some have been effective, some have not. The next thing we look toward is a vaccine, and more to come. So it's not like this one solution right away is going to fix everything. So it's not a traditional problem-solving approach. You have to think about it differently. You have to get more heads around it. And I also specialize not just in how those things are interpreted and helping leaders manage their interpretations, but all their biases, the data they're looking for that confirms what they already believe. So you have to get your biases out of the way to help you consolidate those opinions in an effective manner. And then you have to have some way of deciding which experiment you're going to run. And it's like, in some cases, it literally is like slapping a strategy against the wall and seeing what sticks. It's not this 5-year luxurious strategic plan anymore. And so you have to think about your business model differently. You have to think about your plan differently, but you have to bring people into the process differently. And that requires much greater curiosity and listening to learn instead of listening to inform.
Love it. I couldn't agree more with practically everything you said. I first off, you started off by talking about that tendency when you find that you don't have control. You scramble, right? I mean, you scramble because you want to regain that control. It's the same reason I think many people, after they've had successes and then they have losses, it's like they'll do anything to try to get back to that feeling that they had when they were succeeding. And it doesn't work, because you step outside of your process. You step outside of the process that got you to where you were. It's like a batter or a golfer changing their swing dramatically to try to get out of a slump. It never works. You've got to go back to the tried and true that got you where you were to begin with. There is a need for being comfortable in uncomfortable and ambiguous situations, and those are the people that are thriving right now. I've talked to a lot of people, and I'm fascinated by your story of how you've reconfigured things in a pandemic, because people that are thriving in a pandemic, it's because of that adaptability, that ability to evolve, the ability to feel not in control, but to be comfortable in a situation where there isn't control.